September 1944. Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. Takashi Yamamoto's hand trembled as he held the bottle. The glass was cold, impossibly cold against his palm, condensation running down his fingers and dripping onto the worn wooden table. Around him, 300 men sat in absolute silence. The mess hall, usually filled with the scrape of spoons and murmured conversations, had become a cathedral of held breath. The Coca-Cola bottle felt like a bomb. He'd been given strict instructions. 1 bottle per prisoner. A gift from the Red Cross. A gesture of goodwill. The American commander had stood at the front of the hall and explained this in careful, translated Japanese. His voice had been calm, almost gentle. "This is what our soldiers drink," he'd said. "What our families drink at home. We want to share it with you." But Yamamoto had been taught, had known with the certainty of bone-deep conviction, that American food was poisoned. That capture meant torture. That the enemy did not show mercy. They showed cruelty disguised as kindness before the killing blow. Every man in this room had been taught the same thing. Now they all held bottles. Cold glass. Strange red labels with white script they couldn't read. The liquid inside was dark, mysterious, wrong. And every single one of them was watching Takashi Yamamoto to see what he would do. Because somehow, without anyone deciding it officially, he'd become the first. The test case. The man whose choice would give the others permission or warning. His throat was dry. The bottle was growing warm in his grip. 2 years earlier, rural Japan, spring of 1942. Yamamoto had been 21 years old, standing in a formation of 200 new conscripts at the military training depot outside Osaka. The sun had beaten down on their shaved heads. The drill instructor's voice had cut through the morning air like a blade. "The Americans are not human," the officer had said. His face was hard, weathered, decorated with scars from the fighting. "The Americans are not human," the officer had said. His face was hard, weathered, decorated with scars from the fighting in China. "They torture prisoners. They mutilate the dead. They poison captured soldiers slowly, for sport, while they laugh." Yamamoto had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? This was an officer, a man who'd seen combat, a man who represented the emperor himself. "If you are captured," the officer continued, pacing before them like a tiger, "you will be given food and water. You will want to accept it. You will be hungry, wounded, afraid. But the food is poisoned. The water is contaminated. They do this to make you suffer, to make you beg, to strip away your honor before they kill you." The words had sunken like stones into water. Deep. Belmano. A true soldier dies before surrender. A true soldier saves the last bullet for himself. Death with honor is victory. Capture is worse than death. It is shame that poisons your family, your ancestors, your nation. Around him, 200 young men had absorbed this truth. They'd written letters home that night, promising to die well. Yamamoto had written to his mother in their village, 3 hours north by train. He'd promised her he would honor the family name, that he would never bring shame to her or to his father's memory. His father had died when Yamamoto was 12. Tuberculosis. He remembered the sound of coughing through the thin walls of their small house. The way his mother had pretended everything was fine, even as she boiled herbs that did nothing. His father's last words had been about honor, about being strong, about protecting the family name. Yamamoto had believed in honor the way he believed in gravity. It was the structure that held the world together. The training had been brutal. 6 months of it. They learned to shoot, to march, to dig, to fight with bayonets until their hands bled through the blisters. They learned to eat in 5 minutes, sleep in 3-hour shifts, wake to art, drills at midnight. They learned to ignore pain, to push past exhaustion, to see the enemy not as people, but as targets. And always, woven through every lesson, was the reminder, capture is poison. The Americans are demons. Death is honor. By the time Yamamoto shipped out to the Pacific Theater in late 1942, these truths were as much a part of him as his own name. Saipan, July 15, 1944. Early morning. The American bombardment had turned the jungle into hell itself. Trees exploded into splinters. The ground heaved and buckled. The air was nothing but smoke and coral dust, and the screams of men whose bodies had been opened by shrapnel. Yamamoto had been separated from his unit during the night. He'd spent hours crawling through undergrowth, his rifle clutched to his chest, trying to find anyone from his company. Instead, he found bodies. Japanese, American, Korean laborers, all of them equally dead, equally torn apart by the machinery of industrial war. He'd been hit just after dawn, not by a bullet, by shrapnel from a mortar round that had landed 30 feet away. The explosion had lifted him off the ground and thrown him against a shattered palm tree. When he tried to stand, his left leg had buckled. Blood soaked through his uniform pants. The pain was distant at first, muffled by shock. Then it hit him like a second explosion. He'd crawled into a crater, pressed himself against the earth, and waited. For what? He wasn't sure. Death, probably. The honorable death he'd been promised. But the Americans had found him first. He remembered their faces. Young, dirty, exhausted. One of them had been black, the first black person Yamamoto had ever seen in his life. He'd stared, disoriented, wondering if the blood loss was making him hallucinate. The soldier had knelt beside him, medical kit already open, and said something in English. The tone had been gentle, concerned. This wasn't supposed to happen. The medic, white, Red Cross armband visible, had cut away Yamamoto pant leg and started working on the wound. The pain had been extraordinary. Yamamoto had bitten down on his own forearm to keep from screaming. But the medic's hands had been steady, professional, careful. He'd cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, wrapped it in clean bandages. Then he'd offered Yamamoto water. A canteen, American water, possibly poisoned. Yamamoto had stared at it. The medic had mimed drinking, his face open and earnest. Another soldier had said something, probably drink it, you'll die of dehydration, in English that Yamamoto couldn't understand. He'd been so thirsty. The Saipan heat was murderous. He'd had no water for 16 hours. His training had screamed at him to refuse, to die clean, to maintain honor. But his body had betrayed him. His hand had reached out. He'd taken a canteen. He drunk. The water had been warm, metallic tasting from the container, but clean. Just water. Not poisoned. Just water. He'd waited to feel the poison take effect. Waited for the burning in his gut, the convulsions, the agony he'd been promised. Nothing had happened. The Americans had put him on a stretcher and carried him down to the beach, where landing craft were evacuating wounded to hospital ships offshore. They'd carried him carefully, avoiding the roughest ground. One of them had even shielded him from the sun with his own helmet. Yamamoto's entire worldview had begun to crack. The hospital ship had been clean. Surreally, impossibly clean after weeks in the jungle. White sheets, electric lights, the smell of disinfectant instead of rot and cordite. A Navy doctor had operated on his leg, actually operated with anesthesia and surgical tools and real medical care. They'd save his leg. Why would they do that? Why would the enemy, demons who supposedly tortured prisoners for sport, give him anesthesia? Why would they care if he kept his leg? The cognitive dissonance had been so severe it felt like a physical illness. Yamamoto had lain in his bunk on that ship, surrounded by wounded Americans and a handful of other Japanese prisoners, and felt his mind try to reconcile two incompatible truths. Truth 1. Americans are demons who torture and poison. Truth 2. Americans just saved my life. One of these had to be false. But which one? The train to Camp Lordsburg had taken 4 days. 4 days of American landscape rolling past the windows, desert and mountains, and vast empty spaces unlike anything in Japan. 4 days of being fed twice daily. Rice, some kind of meat, bread, water that wasn't poisoned. The other prisoners had been silent, each man locked in his own reckoning. At night, in whispered conversations, some of them had tried to explain it. It's a trick, one man had said. They're fattening us up before the torture. Another had suggested, they're keeping us alive to use as slave labor. A third had been more philosophical. Maybe they follow their Geneva Convention. Maybe they have rules. But the rules they'd been taught said Americans had no honor. No merci. No rules except cruelty. The train had pulled into Lordsburg on a blazing afternoon in late July. The camp had been basic wooden barracks, barbed wire, guard towers, but it had been organized. Clean. The guards had processed them with bureaucratic efficiency. They'd been assigned bunks, given new clothes, shown the latrines and washhouses. No torture. No beatings. No starvation. Just a camp. A prison, yes, but nothing like the hell they'd been promised. Yamamoto had spent his first weeks at Lordsburg in a fog of confusion. The camp held about 300 Japanese prisoners, most captured in the Pacific Island campaigns. Some had been here for months. They'd settled into routines, work details, English classes for those who wanted them, even a small garden that the prisoners were allowed to tend. The American guards were neither cruel nor particularly kind. They were just men doing a job. Some were decent. Some were cold. Some tried to learn Japanese words. Some didn't bother. The camp commander, a man named Thompson, was different. He was older than most military officers Yamamoto had seen. 45 at least, maybe 50. His hair was graying at the temples. He walked with a slight limp, a combat injury from the First War, someone had said. He spoke at camp assemblies through a translator, always about practical matters, work schedules, male privileges, camp rules. But his eyes had been sad, tired. Yamamoto couldn't quite read the expression. Thompson had announced the Coca-Cola delivery on a Wednesday morning in early September. Gentlemen, he'd said through the translator, the American Red Cross has sent a gift. Coca-Cola, a soft drink popular in the United States. 1 bottle for each man. It will be distributed at dinner this evening. This is a gesture of goodwill. Nothing more. The mess hall had erupted in whispers the moment he'd left. It's the poison, someone had said. This is it. This is how they do it. Why wait this long? Another man had countered. They could have poisoned our food any day. Maybe they want us to choose it, to take it willingly. Maybe it's a test, to see who refuses. All afternoon, the camp had buzzed with speculation, fear, suspicion, and underneath it all, a desperate, treasonous hope that maybe it was exactly what Thompson said. Just a drink, just a gift. Now, in the mess hall, Yamamoto held that gift in his shaking hand. The bottle had been cold when they distributed it, pulled from ice chests that must have been brought in special. The glass had been almost painful to hold at first, shocking cold in the New Mexico desert heat. But he'd been standing here, frozen in indecision, for several minutes now. The glass was warming. Body temperature, his palms sweating against it. He looked at the label. The script was incomprehensible to him, but the design was interesting. Red and white, elegant curves. The bottle itself was beautifully shaped, narrower in T. The middle like a woman's waist. Even the object itself felt like American excess. Why make a bottle this elaborate for a drink? Around him, men waited. Some had set their bottles down, unopened. Some held them like he did. A few had already made the decision. Their bottles sat empty, and they looked pale, frightened, waiting to feel the effects of whatever poison they'd ingested. But they didn't look poisoned. They just looked scared. Yamamoto thought about his training. The officer's voice. They poisoned captured soldiers slowly, for sport. He thought about the American medic on Saipan, his hands gentle on a ruined leg. He thought about the clean hospital ship, the train ride, the camp itself, basic but humane. He thought about honor, about shame, about dying clean versus living with uncertainty. He thought about his mother, who would never know what happened to him out here, who would receive a letter someday, if she was still alive, saying he'd died in combat. The letter wouldn't say where or how. It wouldn't say he'd surrendered. It wouldn't say he'd survived this long. Would drinking this bottle add to his shame? Or had he already fallen so far that one more compromise didn't matter? His fingers tightened on the bottle. The glass had warmed in his grip, no longer cold, but body temperature now. Around him, 299 men waited. Some had their own bottles. Some were still deciding. But everyone was watching him. The first man to choose. Whatever he did next would ripple through this room, through this camp, through the rest of his life. He thought of the propaganda officer's voice. The Americans will poison you. He thought of the American medic who'd stitched his wounds on Saipan. He thought of nothing and everything. And then he lifted the bottle to his lips. The rim was smooth against his mouth. Glass. Just glass. He tilted it back, and the liquid hit his tongue, and the world exploded. Not with pain, not with poison, with sweetness. Overwhelming. Shocking, impossible sweetness. It flooded his mouth like nothing he'd ever tasted. Sugar, more sugar than he'd had in 2 years of war, crashed against his taste buds. And underneath it, something else. Bubbles. The liquid was alive, fizzing and dancing on his tongue, a sensation so foreign it was almost violent. The carbonation burned slightly, tickled, made his eyes water. And the taste itself. Beneath the sweetness, there was something dark, complex, a flavor he couldn't name. Not fruit exactly, not medicine, something in between. Caramel? Spice. He had no vocabulary for it. It was utterly, completely American, as foreign to his palate as English was to his ears. He swallowed. The cold liquid ran down his throat. The bubbles continued their assault all the way down. His stomach received this strange invasion and sent back a signal. More. I want more. He took another sip. Longer this time. The sweetness was less shocking now, more welcome. The carbonation still startled, but in a pleasant way. The flavor began to separate into layers, that caramel darkness, a hint of vanilla, maybe something citrus, something he couldn't identify at all. It wasn't poison. It was delicious. His eyes closed involuntarily. Not from pain. From a sheer, overwhelming sensation of tasting something this rich after months of plain rice and thin soup. After 2 years of military rations designed for function, not pleasure. This was pleasure in a bottle. This was excess. This was everything he'd been taught America represented: decadent, unnecessary, wasteful. And it was wonderful. When he opened his eyes, every man in the mess hall was staring at his face. Yamamoto looked down at the bottle in his hand. Half empty now. He'd drunk without thinking, without deciding, his body making the choice his mind couldn't. The dark liquid swirled gently. More bubbles rose to the surface. The glass was still cool, but warming fast in his grip. He met the eyes of the man across from him. Suzuki. Seti. Years old, captured on Tinian. Suzuki's bottle sat untouched on the table in front of him. It's not poison, Yamamoto said. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. It's just a drink. Suzuki stared. Then, slowly, he reached for his bottle. The movement rippled through the hall like wind through rice fields. All around the room, men lifted bottles to their lips. Some hesitant, faces tight with fear. Some decisive, as if Yamamoto's survival past the first sip was proof enough. The silence broke into a rustling of movement, the click of glass against teeth, the soft sounds of 300 men confronting the same impossible reality. The first reactions were almost uniform. Eyes widening, faces registering shock. A few men actually pulled the bottles away from their mouths fast, as if the taste itself was aggressive. One man near the back started coughing. The carbonation had gone down wrong, Yamamoto guessed. But no one collapsed. No one convulsed. No one showed signs of the poison they'd been promised. Instead, slowly, faces began to change. The fear didn't disappear. Fear that, bone deep, doesn't evaporate in moments. But something else crept in alongside it. Confusion. Wonder. A few men even smiled, tentative and guilty, as if pleasure was a betrayal. Yamamoto took another drink. The sweetness was less shocking now, almost familiar. He could taste it properly, the complexity of it, the way the flavors evolved as the liquid warmed in his mouth. How had the Americans made something this elaborate? How much sugar did this contain? How did they make the bubbles? And beneath all those questions, a deeper one. Why give this to us? Suzuki finished his bottle first. He set it down on the table with a definitive thunk and stared at it like it was an artifact from another world, which Yamamoto supposed it was. I thought. Suzuki started, then stopped. His voice sounded strange. Thick. I thought it would burn. I thought my throat would close. I thought. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone in this room had thought the same thing. Across the hall, someone laughed. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place that every head turned. It was Tanaka, one of the younger prisoners. 19 years old. He was holding his empty bottle up to the light, examining it, and laughing. Not hysterical laughter, just genuine amusement. "It tastes like candy," Tanaka said, his voice carrying in the now quiet hall. The Americans' great weapon. Candy in a bottle. A few other men laughed, tentative at first, then more easily. The tension in the room began to shift. Not disappearing. It would take more than one drink to undo 2 years of indoctrination, but cracking, like ice on a river in early spring. Still there, still solid, but showing the first hairline fractures. Yamamoto finished his bottle. The last sip was mostly backwash and melted carbonation, warm and flat, but he drank it anyway. Waste nothing. That was habit from years of deprivation. He set the empty bottle on the table next to Suzuki's. The glass clinked. 2 empty bottles. Proof of 2 men who'd survived the poison. Around them, the hall slowly came back to life. Not the usual dinner sounds. This was different. Men were talking. Actually talking, not just murmuring. Comparing reactions. Asking each other questions. Did yours taste like? The bubbles, did you feel? How did they make? For the first time since capture, they weren't just prisoners enduring. They were men experiencing something together. Something strange and confusing and impossible to fit into the reality they'd been taught. That evening, after the guards had collected the empty bottles, evidence, Yamamoto thought, though of what he wasn't sure, the prisoners gathered in small groups throughout the camp. The September desert air had cooled to something almost pleasant. Stars emerged in the vast New Mexico sky. More stars than Yamamoto had ever seen, unpolluted by city lights or jungle canopy. He sat with 5 other men from his barracks on the steps of Building C. No one had declared this a meeting. They just gravitated together, drawn by the need to process what had happened. "My instructor," said Kawamoto, a man in his 30s who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, "told us they would use kindness as a weapon, that they would give us things, food, comfort, medicine, to make us weak, to make us betray information. But we don't have information," Tanaka pointed out. "We're infantry. We knew where our units were, but our units are destroyed. What would we betray? Positions that don't exist anymore.